stepping into the kitchen with Roger BelAir today. Roger is a twice published author, public speaker, and of course is most well known for teaching pickleball in prisons. Roger, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Katie, it's nice to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Great. So we have a lot of things to learn about you, but first, just tell us a little bit about your background and especially how you got connected with pickleball.
Well, my background originally started out in banking. My focus wasn't so much of materialism, but I really wanted financial security, and I happened to be very fortunate to do some things real estate-wise. And at the age of 30, I was paying back college loans, and at the age of 37, I was part of a profile for Money Magazine. That started my process, and that really opens doors when you get that type of publicity. One of the phone calls I received was from Doubleday in New York, and they asked me if I would be interested in writing a book on investments. And my first reaction was, I don't even write letters. I don't even write my mother. But then I thought, a lot of professional athletes can do something like that. Maybe I can too. So I wrote a book. It sold quite well. I was asked to write a second book, which I did. And then that led to a professional speaking career. Because if you write a book, people think you know something about it. So I was asked to speak at a variety of business conventions around the country. So I had that background. I fell in love with pickleball just like everybody else. And so I just kind of merged the two about teaching pickleball. And so that's really the way I started.
So Roger, I'm sure your background in public speaking has been really beneficial in how you interact with your students. Can you tell us how you got involved into public speaking?
I was at a party one night and I met this man and we started chatting, and he said his name was Vince Lombardi. And I said, really? And so we chatted a little bit more, and his dad was the coach. And he said, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I just came out with this book. And he said, Roger, why don't you consider professional speaking? There's a lot of business conventions. I do it quite a bit around the country, and I often talk about motivational subjects. But let agents know that you're available. So I said, well, that sounds like fun. I think that's something I'd enjoy, and it's an awful lot easier to find a new audience than it is a new speech. If you're a college professor, the students pretty much have to be there. They don't have an awful lot of choice, and so you can just provide information. However, if you want to be a professional speaker, they can choose from a long list of people. You better be good. You better be informative. You better be able to keep the audience awake. It's really beneficial if you can use humor. And so I realized that those components are really important in speaking, but they're also really important in teaching. So I tell a lot of stories. For example, Barney McCollum was a good friend of mine, and he's one of the founders of pickleball. And so I tell stories about working with Barney, about working with his son David, who ran the original company. And they're short stories, they have some humor, but they relate to the game. And I said, all right, everybody, let's get back out on the court and implement this. One cute story that you might really enjoy about Barney is he just passed away last November at the age, I think he was 93. And in the last few years of his life, he was in a retirement center. So one day I went up to see Barney one morning, and I knocked on the door, and he said, come in. And he looks at me and says, Roger, sit down. Would you like a cup of coffee, or would you like a shot of whiskey? And I said, Barney, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Before noon I don't drink coffee. He laughed, I laughed, and we had a glass of orange juice. But he was a real character.
Wow. So you've done it all, definitely. And it's interesting that you started in finance and now have ended up in prison, so to speak.
Yeah.
So tell us exactly how you got connected to bringing the game of pickleball into prisons.
Well, what happened one night is my wife and I were watching 60 Minutes, and they had a segment on Sheriff Tom Dart, who runs Chicago's Cook County Jail. They have more homicides in Chicago than they do in New York City and LA combined. But during this segment, I noticed that the inmates, well, they're not really inmates, they're really detainees, were just kind of sitting around. So I came up with the idea that, it'd be so much better for everybody if these inmates were getting exercise as compared to just sitting around playing cards. So I wrote Tom Dart a letter. Tom gets a lot of letters, as you can imagine. That night over dinner, he happened to mention this game of pickleball, and he had no idea what it was. And his 8-year-old daughter said, "Dad, I'll tell you about pickleball." So she did, and it wasn't too long after that I was back on my way to Chicago.
And when you showed up at the Cook County Jail for the first time to teach, what was the reaction that the inmates gave you?
Well, first of all, it was my reaction as I stood outside the jail looking at the sign that says Cook County Jail, maximum security. And the thought that went through my mind is, Roger, what are you doing here? But it was too late to turn back. I went in, we had a few introductions, and I was taken into Division 10 and then address some of the inmates about the game. Well, they were sitting around in chairs, and I mentioned the game of pickleball, and none of them had ever heard of it. And they were apathetic at best, eyes rolling, arms crossed, that type of thing. And I took a deep breath and just kept talking a little bit about the game. But fortunately, a minute or two later, I had them out on the court. Once they were on the court, they absolutely loved it.
And what is it about pickleball in particular that you think has drawn the growth of bringing pickleball to other prisons?
First of all, it has some major advantages. My initial focus was, here's just a way that people can get exercise. And that's a great benefit for all of us to get exercise. When I wrote my letter to Sheriff Dart, I also said, I can work on life skills as well, like thinking about consequences, learning from mistakes, being a better teammate. And so I really focused on both of those avenues when I went into the prison. But there's really more to it than that. Inmates on the inside, I've learned, love this game so much that they'll behave themselves. There'll be less violence inside the prison because they want to play pickleball. And they know that if they don't behave themselves, then they can't play. So there's a fallout benefit that I hadn't really thought of initially, as well as it really breaks down communication barriers. But I'm thinking of one situation right now where I'm sitting on a bench and I'm talking to an inmate who had been charged with attempted murder. And he said, Roger, look out there on the court. Some of these guys would not even talk to each other before pickleball. They're in opposite gangs. And now look at them. They're not only playing together, they're laughing together. And isn't that wonderful?
And I bet that you've also faced some other challenges, aside from maybe some of the blank stares or crossed arms that you got when you first went in. What are some other challenges that, the average person might not consider that you're dealing with when teaching this in prisons?
It varies from institution to institution. Some believe in rehabilitation. Many are saying, hey, we just are warehousing these people and they're here to be punished. My focus is really quite simple in the sense that if we can make them better people on the inside, then what happens is eventually they're going to be out and they're going to be in our parks where kids are playing. They're going to be on our freeways. And if we can make them better people on the inside, it makes it safer for all of us once they get outside.
Have you faced any unruly students?
I'm not sure I have. What has happened from time to time is an inmate might say, I don't want to play today, or I'm sick, or I got a headache. But once people get on the court, they just love it. And the magic is not in me. The magic is in the game. I teach not only in prisons, but also I'm very fortunate to teach. I'm the guest instructor at a destination health spa called Rancho La Porta. It's right outside San Diego. So I kind of cover the gamut from people that of the extremes of our society, from people on the inside that maybe have been convicted of murder to people who are fortunate enough to go to a wonderful place like Rancho La Porta. And I think one of the things that we all have in common is once we get on the court, we forget about our problems. We forget about our financial problems, maybe our spouse problems, health problems, whatever. We're just simply focusing on hitting this ball over the net. And so that applies to really all players. And isn't it wonderful that we can have an activity that really takes us away from ourselves to something that's just that joyful?
Mm-hmm. It's clear that you bring a unique perspective when you're teaching pickleball. Like you said, no matter whether it's to a convicted murderer or to people at these destination health spas. What are some other things that you try to instill upon the people that you work with when teaching pickleball?
Well, the most important thing whenever I step out on the court is safety. So I talk about if there's a ball on the court, say ball on court, don't run backwards, because that's number one. Number two, what I want them to do is have fun, because if they have fun, then they want to try it again. When I'm working with people on the inside, I don't need to worry about that. Do you want to sit in the cell all day long, or do you want to get on the court and have fun? And these inmates would play 24/7 if allowed to. I really try not to talk too much. What I like to do is I like to talk for maybe a couple minutes. Maybe there'll be some humor in it. Maybe it'll be a short story, and then I get them out on the court. So it's very interactive as compared to me sitting up there and talking for 15 or 20 minutes and then getting to play. I think it's much better to have very short segments, and it seems to work very well for me. An officer will stand up and say, today we have Mr. BelAir, and he's this and he's that. First thing that comes out of my mouth is, guys, my name's Roger. Mr. BelAir is my father. And it usually gets a chuckle. But they know that I'm not talking down to them. And what I do is I talk about the game, and I just kind of order people around, and for whatever reason, they seem to follow. I was in one prison, and they were saying to me that what they did when they served is they dropped the ball and then hit it. And I said, well, there's two reasons for you not to do that. One reason is when you leave here, I want you to be able to walk into any court, pickleball court in the country, and walk right in and be able to play. I don't want you to come in with a set of rules that they say, where have you been? Where'd you learn something like that? And then I say, all right, let's play. And somebody will say, well, wait a minute, you said there's two reasons why we should follow the rule. And what's the second reason, Roger? And I said, well, that's real easy. Just do it my way and nobody gets hurt. They all laugh and they say, okay, Roger, we'll do it your way. Humor works for me because it's kind of who I am. So I don't have to think about it. I just say what comes out of my mouth. But there's a lot of different stories. And I'll share one with you that happened the very first time I was there back in Chicago. Is I play a game, we were pretty close to the net, and I say the score goes up to 11. And so sooner or later we got to 11. And then what I do is I look at the guys and say, all right, everybody, group hug. Well, you can just imagine these guys just froze. I mean, group hug, there's no way in the world that they're interested in something like a group hug. But what I did was I put up my paddle and they put up theirs, and I tapped it and I said, that's a group hug, guys.
Roger, we know that you started teaching pickleball in Cook County. How many times have you gone in there to teach pickleball?
I've been back at Cook County 3 times. And the last time I was there was very interesting, because I shared with you earlier what it was like the first time, but the last time I was there, I felt like Santa Claus walking into a grade school. There also happened to be a reporter for USA Today who showed up and was doing a story on pickleball on the inside. And they invited him because I was back there. Well, the reporter wrote up the story. It was destined for the sports page. But what happened was the editors were so impressed with the story that they decided to hold it and put it on the front page of USA Today. After Cook County Jail, I ended up going to New York City. Their main jail is called Rikers Island. They have about 5,000 or 6,000 kind of inmates at one time. They're actually detainees because they haven't gone in front of the judge. But they have about 100,000 men and women that flow through that system every year. The deputy commissioner was so impressed with the results from pickleball that he ordered equipment for all 10 of their sites. So many of the people who flow through Rikers Island in New York are now learning the game. And on the inside, it's very noisy. It's a little bit, because there oftentimes not any windows. So you have all these people screaming, and it's kind of like before a football game when all the players get really close to the coach, and the coach is yelling out instructions, but everybody's right there. And that's kind of the way it was when I was back in New York at Rikers Island, and I was just wrapping up the session, and I said something like, well, I hope you guys play a lot and enjoy the game and stay safe and don't get into trouble. And there was this large inmate next to me who grabbed me, and all of a sudden the thought goes through my mind, oh, I'm going down, I'm being kidnapped, what's going to happen? Am I going to break me in two? And then he let me go and he said, group hug, Roger, thank you.
Now, when you are not teaching pickleball in prisons and when you're not teaching pickleball at Rancho La Puerta, what might we find you doing, Roger?
Well, you can probably find me reading. I spend a fair amount of time reading. I probably read about 3 hours a day. I like to travel because I love experiences. I've traveled to over 60 countries. I enjoy cooking. I've taken 100 cooking classes around the world. That tells you that I burned a lot of pans. I kind of word it this way. I think when somebody's young, they ought to try everything to find out what they love. But as they get older, they ought to kind of focus on what they love because they don't have as much time left. So I spend a lot of time on pickleball. I spend a lot of time on reading. I spend a lot of time on investments.
Or who are some other mentors that have really taught you things throughout your life or who have instilled the values that you have today?
Well, one of the big ones is Warren Buffett. You can have a mentor without even knowing the person. But I respect him so much because he comes from a place of integrity and he has just tremendous advice. So he's an individual that I follow on a regular basis. I spend about 3 hours a day reading, and that's one of the things I learned from Warren. He spends 5 or 6 hours a day reading. But when you read about different people, you can see what they do and how they do it, and then you take some of those qualities and you try to incorporate them in your own life. I grew up in a neighborhood that is where Bill Gates grew up, and there's a lot of stories about Bill. And there's a lot of stories about his family. And one of the stories that I heard years ago was there was a dinner party at Bill Sr.'s house, and he had a variety of people. And after dinner, he said to Warren Buffett, who was there, he said, Warren, I'd like you to say in just one word, what do you attribute your success to? Warren thought for a second, and he said, focus. And then Bill's dad turned to Bill and said, Bill, if you came up with one word, what would it be? Bill thought, and he says, I'll pick the same word that Warren did. I think it's focus. And if we try to dilute our efforts in too many different directions, we kind of lose our perspective of where we want to go. But if you really focus on a kind of a narrow channel, then you can accomplish, big things. And so as it relates to my position in pickleball, my focus is really on the prisons because I know something about the inside. I know how it works. I know in many ways it's dysfunctional, but I also know that here's something that can really help men and women on the inside. And so that's where I spend my time.
Thank you all for joining us on another episode of Stepping into the Kitchen. We hope you enjoyed Roger's story as much as we did. We'll see you next time.